Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, this weekend was half crazy. On Saturday, I left the house at 7 a.m. to drive down to Jersey City so I could record podcasts with Cassandra Kaw and past guest Richard Kadri, who were both in the area from Montreal and San Francisco, respectively, for a reading at the KGB Bar's Fantastic Fiction series. Those both went well. You're going to hear those in February. From there, I drove up to New Haven, Connecticut to Yale for Harold Bloom's memorial service. It was a public event. They were using a piece of my podcast with Bloom from 2016 in the program, so I figured it was okay for me to go, even though the extent of my communication with Bloom was the hour we spent together that morning and one phone conversation we had 20 years earlier that I'm sure he never remembered. I will admit, feel like a bit of an interloper or an outsider at the event. A lot of the comments and remembrances were kind of Yale specific, and high literary in a way that I no longer am. It was still a joyful event. A lot of people celebrating the memory of what Bloom meant to them, interspersed with readings of his and a radio appearance where he talks about the Yankees. So yeah, it was something. And a few of my past podcasts were at the event. Former students of Bloom like David Mickix and Langdon Hammer and our mutual pal Willard Spiegelman. After that, there was a reception at the Beinecke Rare Books Library, which a friend of mine had given me a book about, but I'd never been to. And oh my God, it's one of the most gorgeous places I've ever seen. So I went. The problem was the moment the service ended and they opened the doors from the chapel outside so we could get to the library, I realized the snow we were all fearing had in fact shown up at some point during the service, and it wasn't quite a whiteout, but the roads looked terrible. I knew I was making a mistake going to the reception instead of just getting in my car and going home, but when was this sort of opportunity going to be there again? So I went with the organizers and Bloom's wife and others over to the library, had a good time at the reception, got to catch up with some people, made some tentative podcast dates, even though I went into the afternoon with the rule, the same one I developed at Sandy McClatchy's memorial service: don't pitch anyone on the podcast at someone's memorial service. To be fair, it only came about because a past guest insisted on introducing me to a pal of his who he said I should record with. So, in my defense, also, I did not bring any of my podcast cards with me, even though they were in the car. So I didn't feel like I was debasing the event too much, any more so than my very presence would do. Anyway, from there, I left kind of early so I could get on the road. The snow made the drive back to New Jersey nightmarish. I made it home safe and sound, no incidents or accidents. But the 80 to 85 mile drive turned into almost 3 hours. But again, I'm careful. It's more the other drivers that I'm worried about, and I did a good job of avoiding them. So anyway, I got back home, 2 more episodes in the can. I got to see Harold Bloom off among his friends and family. Got lots to cogitate on. Got to see a woman play a Stradivarius violin for the closing event right before they used my audio segment, and I simply never never experienced anything like watching this woman play. The segment was the song Nigun, Nigun, from Baal Shem by Ernest Bloch. It was played by Serena Huang, Huang, with Nenad Ivovich on piano, accompanying her. It was just transporting. It was an absolutely amazing experience. I sort of wanted to go up to her during the reception and tell her that, realize how creepy and weird that might sound. So anyway, I did not tell her how much I enjoyed the performance, but I really did. And Sunday. So Sunday was Take It Easy Day. Just edited this episode, otherwise chilled the hell out. That's why the weekend was only half crazy. Now, before we get to the new episode, I want to put out one last reminder. I'm going to host a New York City area memorial for Tom Spurgeon, also known as Comics Reporter, my closest friend, this podcast's greatest supporter. The event's going to be this Friday, January 24th, 2020, for you time travelers, at the Society of Illustrators on East 63rd Street. There's information about it on, just go to my Twitter feed, VMS Pod. I've been posting a link to the Eventbrite page where people can find out more info and RSVP. So go to Twitter, VMS Pod, or go to chimeraobscura.com/VM. There's a link there, but it's much easier to find just going through my Twitter feed. And now, on with the show. This week's guest is critic, memoirist, classicist by training, but not classicist, translator, and, all-around fantastic writer, Daniel Mendelsohn. Daniel's new book is a collection called Ecstasy and Terror, From the Greeks to Game of Thrones. It's published by New York Review Books. It's a wonderful collection filled with a ton of Daniel's thoughtful, insightful, incisive, essay, memoir, criticism hybrids on a whole bunch of, or a whole range of cultural topics, as in from the Greeks to Game of Thrones. I've always enjoyed his pieces when I've come across them in the New Yorker, New York Review of Books, etc. So having a collection like Ecstasy and Terror is an absolute joy. And this one has some all-timers in it, like Daniel's personal essay about his history with the author Mary Renaud, as well as a piece on Antigone and the Boston Bomber, reading the Aeneid in a post-colonial world, his critique of Game of Thrones. There's a lot of really amazing stuff, as well as the Critic's Manifesto, which is a pretty neat touchstone to have. So that's Ecstasy and Terror. But it's Daniel's previous book that really got me, and that one is An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic. It's out in paperback now from Viking. Came out originally in 2017. And it's a memoir-ish about a semester where Daniel is teaching the Odyssey to freshmen at Bard College, and his 80-something father asks to sit in on the class. The book chronicles that semester with his students and explores Homer's themes and structures and the various ways in which we see Odysseus and Penelope, and gets into Daniel's history with his father and what the semester helps them and doesn't help them to reconcile from a very, I don't even want to say troubled. It's a very colorful history that Daniel has and that his father has. But he weaves it all together beautifully. It is one of my favorite books of the past decade. I've given away a few copies already, so stay on my good side. Maybe I'll get you one too. So between An Odyssey and the new Ecstasy and Terror collection, I figured it was time to pitch Daniel on a podcast. And of course, despite the classics background and all of our other areas of common interest, the first thing we really got to talking about was the Marvel Comics universe, because, why not? Anyway, it's a fun conversation, and this will sound weird. Daniel is one of those writers who makes me feel better about my own failure as a writer, because he writes the pieces I would love to see in this world. And that means I don't even have to try, if that makes sense. The idea that someone is out there writing the things that I'd love to read, not that it shares my opinions, but we get into what reviewing and criticism is in this conversation, and, it'll all make sense. Now, as caveats go, not much. We recorded at Daniel's home about 2 hours north of New York, near Bard College, where he teaches. So none of that Manhattan noise we're used to with the sirens, trucks, little kids, etc. My audio levels were a little high for his mic, but it works out okay. Now here's Daniel's bio from the flap copy for Ecstasy and Terror. There's a more extensive one at his website. Daniel Mendelsohn teaches at Bard and is editor-at-large at the New York Review of Books. His books include An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, How Beautiful It Is and How Easily It Can Be Broken, a collection of essays, and, from New York Review of Books, Waiting for the Barbarians, Essays from the Classics to Pop Culture. His new book is Ecstasy and Terror, From the Greeks to Game of Thrones, also from NYRB. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Daniel Mendelsohn. In full St. John's fashion, I was trying to come up with an opening question, but my problem is there's just too much in all of your criticism in the new collection, as well as An Odyssey, that set me off spiraling in a whole ton of directions. So I thought I'd ask instead just how you felt your critical voice has changed over the decades you've been writing criticism. And do you look at... Well, I'll ask a follow-up question after that, but...
Well, it's funny. I had occasion to think of this recently. I read a review of my new collection, actually. It was very tough and quite disapproving in a lot of ways from a very young critic. And I was sort of reminded of myself 30 years ago. I think there's definitely an evolution. I think, and this is not just true of criticism, I think it's true of all kinds of writing. When you start, there's a great drive to make your mark and be noticed, and critics can do that in a number of ways. You can be extreme, you can be funny, you can be caustic, you can be... And I was all of those things at the beginning, and particularly, when I started, and I think I published my first piece in 1990, so it's just a hair under 30 years that I've been doing this professionally. I would sort of go after things, and have sort of screechingly funny put downs, and after a while that gets old, I think. At a certain point you want to be serious. Not that I don't think I wasn't serious, but there were sort of easy targets that I...
But being taken seriously, perhaps.
Yeah, or be serious for yourself. Sure, I think at a certain point in any career, you want to feel that you're being serious. Doesn't matter who's noticing. So, I had this early gig at New York Magazine as the weekly book critic, and it wasn't a lot of space. So you sort of had to make a lot of noise and not a lot of time. Those are not the kinds of things that interest me anymore. I think I stopped reviewing things that were just easy targets. And things about which it was easy to sort of be smart. That's not interesting to me anymore. By the time you've done this for 30 years in my case, I was lucky. So I started writing for the New York Times Book Review fairly quickly after I arrived in New York and wanted to be a freelance writer. And so I've been in some high-profile venues pretty much from the start. And I think at a certain point, you've done so many kinds of things. You've sort of said what you have to say about this kind of thing, that kind of thing. And so I think now I just take on things that are interesting to me, that I think I have something useful to add to a conversation, But I definitely think, look, I've been lucky because I finished my PhD in 1994. I'd been freelancing since 1990 while I was doing my graduate degree. I never pursued an academic career. I was writing for the Times within 2 years. I started writing for the New York Review of Books a few years after that. And the New Yorker. So I've always had platforms that have allowed me to write expansively about things that are interesting to me. And except for those early years, I would say between like 1990 and early 1996, when I published my first piece in the New York Times Book Review, and I was scrambling and writing all kinds of pieces for whomever because I was desperate to pay my rent. Apart from that, I've been in a privileged position to sort of write expansively, which is what I do. I do long form essays. And when you have that kind of space, it's a space for a serious engagement. It's not like writing an 800-word column, which I have done, where you have to sort of make your point, get on it, get off it, and say goodbye very quickly. So definitely, I can see an arc both in sort of genre and in, I would say, I don't even know what the right word is.
Tone? Maybe
tone. Again, this word, seriousness keeps cropping up in my mind. You want to be worthy of the places you're writing for when you're writing for the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker. And you want to have it mean something, I think. There are certain kinds of pieces I don't do anymore because I've said everything I have to say. The great danger of doing this for decades is that, I've done the toga and sandals movie takedown. I've done the this, I've done the that. And it's not interesting for me. There are certain kind of pieces that aren't interesting for me anymore. Also, I would say that, for example, I no longer review first novels that I don't like.
Yeah.
Whereas at the beginning, I would have been happy to roll up my sleeves and take on some, overrated, hyped first novel. And now I think, I've been lucky in my career, and let someone else have some luck. Let somebody review this first novel that likes it. So I think, look, you get older, you don't need to score the same kinds of points anymore.
Sure.
So that's basically what I think. It sort of gets harder as you go on, especially when you're doing large, long form pieces, 5,000 words. You want to find things that are stimulating. And after 30 years of doing this very regularly, this is my third collection. The real challenge is finding things that are really engaging, about which you feel you really have something to add. Like there's this story I'd love to tell. I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Bob Silvers, at the New York Review wanted me. I think there was a volume of the Library of America on John Cheever that was coming out. And he said, Danny, it'd be so great to have a big piece about Cheever. And so I spent probably 4 or 5 months reading all of Cheever and reading a lot about Cheever, which is what I do. And at the end of this process, I called Bob. I said, I have nothing to say. There's a lot of John Cheever I love. Mesmerizing, the diaries, this, that, the other. I didn't think I had anything to add to a conversation that was already very engaged. Obviously, this volume was the occasion for a lot of critical retrospectives on Cheever. And I thought, you know what? I don't have anything to say about Cheever that is that much different from what everyone else has said. That would be a waste of my 5,000 words. I could have done it.
Yeah. You would have essentially felt like you were recapitulating.
Yeah. So it needs to be something that I always think of this word traction, that you get some traction out of, some itch that you need to scratch. It's like the Princess and the Pea. You need to be bothered a little bit by something that makes you want to investigate it. And I've said this before, I think that for me, a really interesting piece of criticism is a piece of writing that kind of dramatizes the process by which you came to your conclusion about whatever you're reviewing. And there is no drama if it's not an interesting engagement.
Assigned versus sort of self-started projects?
Well, now, I mean, with these publications that I've written for a long time, I have an editor at the New Yorker I've worked with from the very start, Leo Carey. I wrote for Bob Silvers at the New York Review. For 10 years, I wrote very often for the New York Times Book Review. And now I do things for Pamela Paul. So when you have these longstanding relationships, it starts out, because of course you start out, you're a nobody and you have, no authority. So you do what they tell you to do or what they assign. But at this point, I would say it's 50-50. So I'll think of something or I'll say, like there's some big name production of Antigone coming to BAM, I think, in 2020. And that's a work I've always wanted to write about somehow. And so I thought that'd be a good peg to hang a piece on. So I called my co-editors at the New York Review and I said, I'd really like to do an Antigone thing. But sometimes and this is what you want in an editor. Having a great editor means they think of things that you would not have thought of for yourself. Sure. So I'm doing this big piece for the New York Review, for example, right now about the Marvel Comics universe. Because I'm very interested.
Which is something I wasn't sure if I should ask about, whether you see the Marvel, I had no idea you had anything going on with the Marvel stuff, whether that is seen as a parallel to myth making, to classic myth. Given that my question about the Marvel thing, and I've been a comics geek since I was a child, I segged out of superheroes in college years and moved into the art comics side. I can't think of another art form in which the characters were continued for 50, 60 years straight with the same character, the same Bruce Wayne, the same Peter Parker, etc. Yeah. Knowing that the Greek myths, you start with Homer and then you get these variations done on them by the tragedians. But that's not the same as, Homer's successor continuing the adventures of, all this time. And whether A, there's an art form that does anything like that, and B, whether you see those parallels between the Marvel Comics thing and your classics.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons.
Because that's going to take this conversation a completely different direction than I was expecting, which I'm so happy about.
That's fine. I'm always super interested in this relationship between classics and pop culture, obviously. That's why when Gabe Winslow Yost, one of my co-editors at the New York Review, popped the idea to me, I lighted up like a Christmas tree, because the angle that I'm interested in, and I should say that obviously recently, which is a godsend for me as I start pulling this research together, this great controversy about the Marvel Comics movies and these comments by
Alan Moore. Well, Alan Moore was the big one from the Watchmen side of things, but I'm sure you're coming across other controversies related to this.
Well, no, I'm thinking of, what's his name? The director who said these aren't cinema.
Scorsese.
Scorsese, right, yeah. And so it's great for me because people are thinking about this stuff right now. But the part that engages me, that I suspect will be, if not central, then important in my piece, is exactly this question of myth making. That this is, and now it's been revealed that this, from the very beginning, was meant to be this elaborately interwoven network of mythic dramas, basically. So I'm incredibly interested in that. I think it's a kind of secular myth making, not without religious aspirations, I think. I was a comic book geek too. It wasn't even a matter of being a comic book geek. Everybody read comics when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. That's what you did. You went every week to the Five and Dime and you bought your supply. Yeah. I still remember with particular fondness the Rainbow Batman sequence, which was extreme. And this is before being gay was part of my equation, but even then it seemed quite electrifying. So I think that's interesting to me, and a thing that I often write about, and it's certainly true in Ecstasy and Terror, this new collection, is when certain things become alive in the popular culture, in the general culture, when they take off, when they establish a presence more so than other things do, then you have to take a look and figure out why. You know, that's what I think cultural criticism is. I don't know what other people think it is, but that's what I think, you know. And I've written different pieces over the years about things like, you know, like the Titanic obsession. You know, lots of boats sank. Why is this one that 100 years later, we're still making movies about this, you know? Or in this collection, I was just rereading this piece I wrote because yesterday was November 22nd, the assassination of JFK. You know, why is this something we cannot let go of culturally? I mean, Princess Di, you know, you can name a thousand things where they seem to have a life beyond the discrete elements. Yeah. You know, the sum is far greater than the whole is far greater than the parts. And I think that's when cultural criticism becomes fun. And the way I see it, and not everybody agrees, but, you know, is that as inheritors of Western European civilization, we have a kind of a cultural DNA, which goes back to the Greek and Roman classics. You know, this is how we think about things is so fundamentally determined by this material, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. And when we respond in a very strong way, we're sort of activating that DNA. There's something that happens in real life that is concentric with this sort of cultural programming, let's call it, or this cultural DNA. So the Marvel movies, I think, are a kind of interesting example of this, and this idea of myth making. Look, one could say Game of Thrones sort of hit in the same way, all this fantasy stuff that is so huge, Harry Potter, both in literature and in cinema, you know. When these things become so huge, it's not just because they're well written, you know, or the characters are interesting. You know, it's touching something very fundamental. And I always like to think what that might be.
Well, it's funny to me the way, and it moves away from cultural criticism into the cultural production apparatus thing. Anytime there's a hit like that, like the Titanic film in '99 becoming the biggest thing in the world, what do we get but Pearl Harbor? Right. The next movie studio decides we can make something just like this, and it's going to hit this, and of course it's a fucking disaster.
Right.
And Harry Potter saw its share of knockoffs, none of which could capture. You know.
Yes, and that's actually a good sort of controlled experiment to determine what it is about the original thing that is in fact authentic. Right. I remember seeing Pearl Harbor very clearly, but.
You're one of the few, the proud.
As I recall, unless I'm totally losing my mind, that was Michael Bay.
Yeah. Ben Affleck. The idea was they had James Cameron, who's a great action director. Yeah. We'll get Michael Bay, who's a great action director.
Well, yes, I remember it very clearly, and it was wasn't it Kate
Beckinsale?
Maybe? Beckinsale,
there's all those Kates from that
very pretty boy who sort of didn't have much of a career after that, who dies. I remember. But another example of that is Gladiator. Mm-hmm. So Gladiator was this huge hit. And then everybody suddenly was making, you know,
Troy.
Ancient epics, Troy, and they were awful, right? Yeah. And, you know, my theory about Gladiator is that what it connected to was a kind of a mytheme, if we want to go to the academic language, right? It's a certain kind of plot, a certain plot element that is most famously expressed in The Count of Monte Cristo, right? It's basically a remake of The Count of Monte Cristo, Gladiator, right? This guy, he's betrayed by his friends. He is exiled. He has to learn these arcane skills in a remote location where he's trained in these all kinds of masteries. He returns in disguise to the place from which he was exiled and triumphs over the enemies who betrayed him. And it's completely the Count of Monte Cristo. That's why people like it, because it's a really good story. Yeah. You know, these idiots in Hollywood, they so slavishly imitate without really thinking about what it is about something that people connect to. It's not about gladiators.
Swords
it's
and
a great plot. Yeah. It's a great plot, you know.
But that is giving the writers too much credit.
No, right, exactly. Exactly.
I just watched Hail Caesar again last night, the Coen brothers one, and it's, again, that same laugh about the writers not getting enough credit and deciding they're going to, you know, kidnap the George Clooney character and you know.
Right, yeah.
To that end, though, when we talk about that arc within your criticism, your books, they've been memoirs or collections of critical pieces. Mm-hmm. Do the critical pieces serve as a sort of memoir too in code? Is there an autobiographical element to them, or just something that you see?
Well, I never, you know, I'm anti-category. You know, I think there's obviously a lot of criticism in my memoirs, and in fact, all three of my memoirs are organized around series of readings and different ancient texts. But, you know, I think ultimately my criticism is just as personal. You know, I don't make this huge distinction. I mean, obviously, you know, they're two different genres, but I guess I've been always trying to beat my head against that barrier a little bit. You know, people often in interviews say, well, you know, in your memoirs, you expose yourself and you talk about your personal life. And I always think in my criticism, I expose myself and tell them what I'm thinking. Like, you know, all writing is self-exposure. Criticism is a way of letting people into the inside of your head. I think it's very intimate. And as you know, from reading my pieces, I don't shy away from talking about my responses to different works. And, you know, I have a student who likes to joke that at some point in all of my pieces, I will do two things: mention Greek tragedy and say that I burst into tears. But I think, you know, it's for obvious reasons. You know, a certain kind of criticism pretends to or tries to attain to a kind of mask of impartiality or objectivity or argumentative invulnerability. But it's all personal, you know. It's a crazy exercise, criticism, because one has to sort of pretend it's objective while knowing all along that it's completely a matter of your own taste. And basically, I would say the function of criticism is to pretend that your taste is an absolutely objective, you know, this value judgment, you know. I mean, I'm half joking, but I think that is sort of what you're doing, because, you know, this is one of the really interesting byproducts of the kind of rise of what I want to call amateur, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean non-paid, non-professional criticism. You know, Amazon reviews, Goodreads, lit blogs, all this stuff. I think it's very healthy. You know, at the beginning, there was a lot of anxiety and competition between the critical establishment and all of this other kind of writing, the amateur writing. And I think it's actually been very healthy. And the sort of line you kept hearing is, you know, well, who are you to be judging movies or books for the New York Times, you know? Yeah. So, you know, at one level, I could always say, well, I'm a person who spent 7 years in the basement of the Princeton University Library thinking about literature and how it works. So there is a certain element of study and expertise and all that. But at another level, it is just your taste. And you have to argue your taste in a way that has the appearance of being inevitable. You have to persuade people that your feeling about a book or a movie or an opera or a painting is inevitably the conclusion that one ought to reach. So it is a kind of funny undertaking. And all of this is a very roundabout way of, to come back to your question about the personal, the interaction between the personal and I would say even at times memoiristic aspect or interaction between the intellectual or the critical. I'm not so sure where the line is. I mean, to go back to your first question, I would say, if anything, if I look at the arc of my career, whatever that means, it's about being more and more willing to admit that that line is porous between criticism, memoir. I'm very impatient with these genres.
Did that lead to editorial pushback?
No, I mean, it's not like I'm...
Not nowadays, but when you were establishing yourself.
Well, but I think, I probably was less interested in exploring that boundary when I first started. I mean, if somebody calls me up and asks me for 1,200 words on some new book, I could do it, and it wouldn't even use the word I. But I'm talking about things like, I remember the piece one of my favorite pieces that I ever wrote was about this Almodovar movie called Volver, which I thought was wonderful and was sort of marked this interesting turn, I thought, in that director's own career arc. This very sober, somber, restrained, not madly over the top, which is what one had come to love in him. And I as I recall, I began my essay for the New York Review of Books about this movie, but with a kind of a memoiristic evocation of what Almodovar meant if you were a 20-something gay male in Manhattan in the 1980s, as a way of sort of evoking something about his work, which is the first thing of his that made his reputation here was women on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And it was so camp and so fun and whatever. And I thought it was legitimate to sort of go that route in the piece. And I think I did a sort of similar thing when I wrote about Angels in America. So it's as with every kind of thing about every kind of writing, it's always on an ad hoc case by case basis. I'm not going to make a rule about how much personal or memoiristic material you're allowed to use in a review. I wrote a piece about the 9/11 movies, Flight 93 and the World Trade Center, which I wrote for the New York Review, by talking about my own experience on the morning of 9/11, which seemed to me legitimate, because both of these, particularly Flight 93, as I recall, made claims about documentary accuracy, which I thought were important to address. And so I thought it was legitimate to open the piece by talking about the fact that by pure accident, I happened to be right in that neighborhood that morning and I saw with my own eyes what happened. So it depends. I wouldn't necessarily always have some personal reminiscence in a piece, but I don't care anymore, honestly, about what the lines are. If it works, it works. And you always know when it works and you always know when it doesn't work. I've just finished a new book, a small book, which is my most extreme gesture, I would say, in the direction of interweaving literary and critical material with personal material. It'll come out next September, which sort of...
Anything you can say?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of in a funny way, it moves towards something I talk a lot about in my Odyssey book, an Odyssey. And so it starts out by a reflection on certain stories about scholars in exile over the year, and it twines that around a consideration, again, about this Homeric narrative technique called ring composition, and it twines both of those things, the scholars in exile and the literary critical thing, around the story of difficulties I had writing an Odyssey and trying to find the right form. So I have no idea how to describe the genre of this book. My friends are always...
I'm just kidding.
Maybe. No, but, my friends are always joking that I've been trying to invent, since my first book, really, in 1999, invent a new genre that's like a Greek mythic hybrid of literary criticism and personal memoir. And this is certainly the most extreme. We'll see how it goes.
It's right up my alley. So that was why I was ecstatic to get this chance. It was that, and a few months ago, I sat down with Simon Critchley for his tragedy, The Greeks and Us. It complements, an Odyssey and your work beautifully to me, because you often bring this stuff right into how the parallels are in our day and age.
Yeah, because that's how. I mean, in a funny way, this all goes to the story of why I left academia. I knew already when I was writing my PhD that I didn't want to go on.
See, I'm smarter than you. I figured that out in my master's. But go on.
Yes, right. But I wanted to finish, partly to please my father and partly because I didn't like the idea of unfinished business. But I love this stuff so much, and I just wanted to be able to write about it and talk about it for sort of ordinary people without all of this preposterous at the time. It was sort of the height of theory madness, And I just thought, to hell with that. So it is, I always think it is about us. I mean, I spent my whole career trying to argue that, which is not, and I want to make very clear, which is not to blindly or naively idealize these cultures, which were very weird and not very attractive in many ways. And I think there's a great emphasis in professional classical studies now, academic classics, about revealing, the misogynistic, the slave economies, and it was, important work that is long belated, I think. But what I just thought, wow, this stuff is so great and so interesting. I want to write about it without footnotes. So I always feel the us, because that's what I do. I mean, that is what I do when I write. I want to tell people how interesting this stuff is. And I always see it connected to the present, not in a,
I mean, Simon does too, but he just didn't.
Oh, no.
I
love Simon. I love his work. We've done events together. They're always a lot of fun.
Oh, I can imagine. It's
he's a philosopher. He's a lot smarter than I am.
And he'll explicitly say he's not, as he said during our conversation, that he's not a classicist.
But for that reason, I think very useful, because I think, part of, so I'm a sort of, as I like to say, a lapsed classicist. When you're a little bit outside, I think sometimes it helps to see the contours of the subject. He's coming at it from a very specific angle. I'm coming at it from an angle. And I think it helps you think about it without getting overly bogged down in professional...
In what the current...
Yeah, the current
mode is.
Yeah.
Oh, I also... Unfortunately, have to thank you for disabusing me of one of my pet theories about the Odyssey, which was that Odysseus's fantastic stories are completely made up, either as an excuse for losing his entire fleet and crew, or that he was a serial killer and was coming up with stories to make up for how he managed to kill all these people.
I'm not so sure those things are that different.
But you had Circe's knot in there.
Thanks to Jenny. But I mean, there is a strong... Circe's knot Circe's knot is the thing that is supposed to demonstrate that all of the adventures he narrated are in fact
or at least
actually
that part.
True, or at least that part. But, there's that part in the class that I wrote about in an Odyssey where I described this sort of student rebellion because they really wanted to argue that all of the adventures that Odysseus narrates in books 9 through 12 are completely fabricated. And I'm not entirely sure they're not right in some way, whatever, even if they were based on a true story, as we like to say. I think they're hugely enhanced. But the Odyssey is a work that writers love because it is about the literary imagination, essentially, I think. It's obsessed with narrative, different kinds of storytelling, the uses of storytelling, the abuses of storytelling, too. And so it's irresistible to writers in a way that the Iliad is not, because the Iliad's worried about other stuff, just as important, but different.
Since I didn't get to share it with Simon during our conversation, I do want to share my theory or question about Achilles from the Iliad. In Book 9, Odysseus and Ajax, I think, go to for the entreaty, and the envoy, they
And Phoenix.
Yes, that's right, who ends up staying. And Achilles turns them down and then explains his destiny and the two possibilities. And Odysseus goes back, and he doesn't tell Agamemnon that part. He only tells him all the rejection up until then. And later on, Patroclus, I think in 16, says, if you know something about your destiny that your mother has told you, let us know. And no, there's nothing that I know. Mm-hmm. Either weird textual reconciliation, or is it possible, in my theory, and this is how Achilles ties into tragedies, that he knows, and what he knows he can't even convey to normal human beings. What he knows of his destiny is just gibberish to everyone else. They can't even understand him when he talks about the possibility of going home or being the center of the poem that you're reading in that moment.
Right. The great choice between having a short, glorious life and going home. But
that they don't even hear him when he discusses it.
But somebody hears him, right? I mean, he has told somebody about this.
Yeah.
But I think in Homer, as a rule, when speeches are repeated, as they often are, mm-hmm. somebody says speech X to person A, and then goes back and says speech X to person B, except something's missing or added. Those are moments you have to pay very great attention to. And it's not just because a piece of the text got lost. Those are very deliberate, right?
It was my fourth trip through the Iliad that finally hit me.
No, you have to pay attention. Yeah, so I think Achilles is keeping his cards close to his chest at that point. Well, because he's already, part of the movement of the Iliad, as I understand it, and I'm much more an Odyssey person than an Iliad person, but part of the movement is Achilles' own, I was going to say elevation, I don't even know if that's the right word, separation from the mortal sphere. Mm-hmm. As the epic goes on, he becomes more and more, or less and less human in many ways. And the climax of this is after the death of Patroclus, when he stops eating and drinking, right? And which only the gods do. The gods don't eat mortal food. And so I think it's what you're observing is wholly consistent with a trend of the epic, which is that he's beyond, at a certain point, he's beyond mortal.
And yet he recounts his father and son.
And
in
yet,
those moments,
not right. And it's those inconsistencies where the great poignancy of the epic,
which I never got until I was in my 40s. I read the thing like 3 times from my teens.
That's why you have to keep reading.
And that was it. I finally read it that time.
They are a moving target.
I finally got Achilles as a full being in a way that I always saw him as the way we all tend to do, which is, either entitled or just, immature, raging, etc.
Well, something adolescent. I remember a book came out when I was in grad school called Childlike Achilles, or maybe a little bit before. And there is something both grand and infantile about him. Yeah. I always think, look, we're talking about works at a level of greatness where comparison is kind of preposterous, but I think to a certain extent, I'm almost afraid to articulate this because somebody will write an angry email, but
it's just
I always think, the Odyssey is a poem for grown-ups. It's about the disappointments and complexities of adult life in a lot of ways. That's not all it's about, but you feel you're in the presence of adults. God knows you are in the Iliad too, but Achilles is, I find, a hero who is mesmerizing without being penetrable by my mind, whereas Odysseus, I think I understand, was probably hubris to say that, but I feel like, and Penelope, let me hasten.
Yeah, and I think that's
thinking a lot about her lately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dish.
Well, I was thinking, I had an interesting exchange with Emily Wilson on Twitter.
Which is going to get to my question about you translating Homer. So
I don't know, maybe a year ago. I can't remember what we were back and forth. I mean, it wasn't just the two of us, a bunch of people commenting on something. And she said something interesting, I thought, about, so she had reviewed an Odyssey wonderfully for The Guardian. And then she wrote something else. I can't remember what the text was. And she said, you know, Daniel Mendelsohn keeps talking about the relationship between Penelope and Odysseus as the model of a relationship in which there is a meeting of the minds. And in my own book, An Odyssey, I keep talking about homophrosyne, right? This magical word in Greek literature that means having the same kind of mind as the key to the relationship of Odysseus and Penelope. But she made a point which really shook me up in a good way, that really the match for Odysseus in the Odyssey is Athena. That the real match for Odysseus is Athena, that their minds are really perfectly attuned, but of course he can never have her. And it reminded me of those great TV shows when I was younger, in which there's a tremendous amount of tension. And this is present in the Odyssey when the two leads can never get together, like Moonlighting. Remember that show?
Oh, yeah.
You know, or when I was young, Get Smart, you know, to use a totally different kind of example, although they do finally get together. Yeah. But, you know, the tension generated between two leads who are not allowed ever to consummate an obvious interest in each other, I think the Odyssey is a model for that. And when Emily Wilson said that, I thought, that's interesting. And I thought, because I am in the middle of translating the Odyssey right now, well, more towards the beginning, but thinking a lot about how Penelope, who she is, and how to translate her, you know.
Yeah, what started tell me about the decision to translate Homer, what you bring to it.
Well, you know, like many things in the world of professional publishing, you know, things about which people have ideas, the actual reasons are always less boring. So it never occurred to me to translate the Odyssey. The reason I did translations of the excerpts for my memoir and Odyssey was just I didn't want to have to get involved with rights.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't want to have to pay to use excerpts from the Robert Fitzgerald translation, which is actually the one that I use when I teach.
Okay, I was a Lattimore guy. I've just never tried Fitzgerald except for the Aeneid, but that's
well, yeah. I hate to tell you, but I'm supposed to be replacing Lattimore's Odyssey on the University of Chicago list. So that's why I did my own translations. I just thought I don't want to have to pay whoever owns those rights. Although the Fitzgerald is the translation I always use. I love it. And so, you know, I saw Twitter is my, I guess, keyhole to the universe in a lot of ways. And when it was announced that I was doing this translation, people were like, well, why does he have to translate the Odyssey? Emily Wilson just did one, and so just, I think Peter Green just did one. And well, the bald and very boring reason for this, which has to do with publishing and nothing to do with anything else, is that the University of Chicago Press contacted me because they apparently have been wanting to replace the Lattimore translation on their list for some time. The Iliad, the Lattimore Iliad, is untouchable and is a great classic. And the Odyssey was never as good or as successful. So that's why it happened. The editor-in-chief of the Humanities and Classics division read my book, liked the translations I had done, and she said, well, we've been looking for someone to translate the Odyssey. Do you want to do it? It never occurred to me. It didn't come from me at all. And I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. That'll keep me occupied. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly does. So that's, you know, it's about the backlist. Yeah. It has nothing to do with anything. It does raise what to me is a very interesting question, which is, so why is Lattimore's Iliad so good and why is the Odyssey meh? Mm-hmm. And I could run through a list, right? Fagel's wonderful Iliad, so-so Odyssey. Fitzgerald, marvelous Odyssey, not so good Iliad, right? And the fact is, even though we always think these are two works by Homer, whatever that means, and we don't have enough time to go into that, but, they're two epics of a certain moment in the history of Greek culture. They're totally different thought worlds. And you're either an Odyssey person or an Iliad person. I firmly believe that.
Do people change?
I don't think so. I think it's absolutely temperamental. It's like being either Elizabeth I or Mary, Queen of Scots. You can't be both. It's a matter of temperament.
Old and New Testament.
Yeah, and I think that the Odyssey, if you understand the Odyssey, you are ipso facto not a person who is going to really be at home in the Iliad. I know that's a kind of a grand statement to make, and I'm sure a lot of classicist friends of mine are choking right now, and especially with respect to translation, because there is no act of intimacy in the world of literature that is greater than translating. And I'm skeptical about people who do both, and I think the proof is in the pudding. If you do both, one is always much better than the other, because it's just it's like translating Stendhal or, the Princess of Clèves, it's just different. It's totally different. I don't care if they're supposed to be both Homeric. It's a different imaginary world. The Odyssey is a work I think I understand in many ways. So I'm slowly but surely doing, I do 20 lines a day. And at that rate, I'll be finished by the end of next year.
I was trying to extrapolate
middle of 2021.
Yeah, I was like, that's
luckily, I have I told them I need a very long deadline.
Yeah. Family's response to An Odyssey? You shared parts of it with them in process because it's touching on their lives too.
Well, very little. I never show anything to anybody.
After the
fact? I consulted with my siblings and my mother about
their
factual
their family questions. Stories and things. Yeah.
That I allow myself to do, but I never share writing. Mm-hmm. I think I just don't think it's something you could do. I think, look, it's complicated because, so on one hand, they were all thrilled and happy the book did so well. And I think my mother was very gratified in a lot of ways to have sort of my father memorialized in a certain way. It's complicated when you're one of many siblings.
Yeah.
Because the J. Mendelsohn that readers of this book know, and there are a lot of readers of this book, it's in many translations now, is my version of my father, and it's my father as seen through my eyes and my relationship. My siblings had very different relationships with him. I'm not saying good or bad relationships. I'm just saying every sibling has a different set of parents. And I think it's sometimes hard for them because I'm a writer. My version becomes the version.
Yeah, you crystallize it in the way
only one that people know. And I think in a funny way, it's almost unfair to them. But we've had interesting conversations. My brother Matt, who was a major figure in this Holocaust memoir I wrote, we worked on together over many years. He had a totally different relationship with my father. I remember he was at the book event I did at Politics and Prose in Washington, wonderful bookstore in Washington. And, he raised his hand. He was like, well, the J. Mendelsohn you're getting in this book is a very specific version. I think that's important for people to remember. I think it's important for people to remember about any kind of memoir.
And it's explicit within the book itself.
Yeah.
I mean, you said one of your major themes, awful word, is,
totally.
How much of ourselves do we know? How much do other people know of us, and how much can we know of anyone else?
Yeah, it's, to me, one of the most interesting, as a memoirist who comes from a deep literary background, I am not naive about the problematics, let's call them, of memory with respect to narrative. And that's, I think, all of my quote unquote memoirs are about this, even going back to my first one, which is now 20 years old. the elusive embrace. You know, who gets to tell stories? How much of the stories they tell is identical with what actually happened, you know, and what are the, and often unconscious impulses to re-narrate the past in the way that seems suitable to you. I think all memoirists should think about this because obviously it's a genre that's about memory. But it's one that I'm willing to put on the surface of my book. In all of my, never know what to call them, you know, narrative nonfictions, whatever. I'm always putting on the surface of the book this problem about memory. So, for example, in this book about my dad, you know, there are scenes in the book where I'm emailing my siblings or talking to them, asking them about family stories about my father. And it always turns out that I have a story, what I've remembered or the version I thought I knew is totally different from what they do. So I think it's, I think it's interesting to put that on the surface as a reminder to readers that, you know, when you pick up a memoir, I mean, now, you know, there are famous examples of this, but, you know, you only know what the author is saying. That's the only thing you know. You don't know what actually happened.
See, this came up when I recorded with Clive James a couple of years ago, and it was, his series was called Unreliable Memoirs. His whole thing was, there's some invention, but, you know, it gets at what matters.
Yeah.
He contends it's an American fetish on factuality within memoir that other countries, even English-speaking countries, do not have the same absolute fix. This is what had to have happened.
Yes, but I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's an interesting point because we, more than other places, are obsessed with the boundary between fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah.
You know, so now, as you know, it's prize season, literary prize season. They're announcing everything, the end of the year. And I always crack up, you know, that we're, I don't know what it comes from, but in this country, literature, with a capital L, really only means fiction.
Yeah.
And everything else is nonfiction. When you think about it, it's so hilarious. So you look at the lists. So the Times just the other day announced its 5 best fiction and 5 best nonfiction. But, you know, nonfiction is everything that isn't a novel. It's an idiotic way to think about literature, right? That means criticism, memoir, history, sociology, politics, political memoir. How could this be a category? It's a non-category, in fact, very much in line with its name. So I think we fetishize that divide more than other countries do. And this is anyway a modern thing. The Greeks didn't give a fuck if a biography was true or not. They're just meant to be ethically instructive. Well, you didn't care if that stuff actually happened to
Herodotus?
Cyrus the Great.
Oh, okay. I was going to go into history. So, whatever. We'll let it go.
Well, the Herodotus I have a lot more respect for in the truth category than Thucydides, who at the beginning, and he's the one who's supposed to be so rigorous, and he says, well, I'm just going to make up speeches that people would have said if they were in that position. And you're like, and here's the master of rigorous journalism. Are you freaking kidding me? So I think it's true what Clive James said. We're obsessed with this true, not true thing because fiction, nonfiction is very important to us in a way that I think is deserving of further interrogation, to say the least.
Yeah, I'm flashing on the Kabbalah. I don't know if you have that side of classic education. The concept of Tzimtzum, the God is everything. The universe is the bubble that God creates by withdrawing himself from it. So, yeah, you've got fiction in that little bubble, and everything else is this world of nonfiction. That's
And it's reflected in the culture at large. There are so many prizes for fiction: first fiction, middle fiction, last fiction, this fiction, that fiction. You know, there's virtually very little in comparison for nonfiction.
Yeah, unless it's focused on like a journalism project or something like that. How have students changed for you over the years? What have you noticed?
Well, you know, I feel like that's a trap.
Yeah, well, they're not listening. It's okay.
Well, I think, look, I mean, everybody loves to complain now about snowflakey students. And I will say, I started teaching as a graduate assistant in 1989 after I passed my comps. as I earned my PhD, January 1989. So that's 30 years now I've been teaching undergrad. It's always weird to be contacted by from former undergrad whom you imagine as a 21-year-old, and they're a 49-year-old, with grown children. So I think that's true to some extent. I mean, painting in very broad strokes. Excuse me. I think, this whole issue of anxieties and sensitivities is off the charts. Me and my colleagues, I would say, spend 40% of our time professoring and 60% of our time nannying or being expected to nanny, which I deeply disapprove of. And the extent to which you're expected to know and care about your students' personal lives, their dramas, their crises, their breakups, their limitations, their anxieties, I think is dangerous and not a healthy sign. So I do think that's a thing. I'm sure there are many people who are listening to this who will be frowning and pushing back, but that is something I and many, many, many professors of all ilks and all political stripes have noticed. So I'm willing to say it's a thing. On the other hand, these students are more politically sophisticated, intellectually sophisticated, critically aware, politically aware than any generation previously. Maybe that's why they're so anxious. I don't know. So I think like everything else, you have to take the bad with the good. That's my impression. I often do kvetch about these students and their emails and a girl wrote to me. She said, I can't hand in my paper. I suffer from deadline anxiety. I burst into laughter. I said, honey, welcome to my world. But they are smarter. Yeah. They know more. They're hipper. They're more sophisticated readers than were the students that I had in 1989. So it's a mixed bag.
This actually brings up something from the Critic's Manifesto at the end of Ecstasy and Terror that I thought of. You talked about in that piece how the internet affected criticism. There was one angle that I wish you'd gotten to, which is a chunk of criticism is the erudition of the critic, or at least the knowledge of the subject you're pursuing. Mm-hmm. And the internet links out. You can almost provide instant erudition. We know it's not in depth, but if you're writing a piece online, as reading the online version of a Critic's Manifesto, for example, you can link out to a Balanchine, to this one, to that one, that can provide the reader with enough of a context and a framework that in some respects, I don't know if you see it that way, that writing, especially for something that's going to be online, is a different sort of critical, doesn't require the same degree of background, explicit background. I don't know. I don't make any distinction. If somebody is paying me to write something, then I think they're paying for the whole. Yeah. I just wonder if you see it in that respect, I don't approach in the ability to refer out to things instantly instead of in print. But that's just because I'm old school. Look, yeah. I mean, I'm going to be 60 next year. My imagination and my habits were formed pre-internet, so I treat everything the same. I don't do a piece that's going to be in some. First of all, I don't do online stuff because it doesn't pay, and I write for a living, so. Yeah. But I don't do an online piece like pieces in this book that I wrote for the New Yorker Page Turner, their literary website. I don't go about them differently than if I'm doing a 4,000 word piece for the New York Review of Books. I mean, when it comes to linking, the fact that there are links within the online versions of those. But that I don't have anything to do with. I didn't know if those come from your end. No. I don't have anything to do. I turn in my copy and then I imagine, create they just start highlighting and stuff. Well, look, I'm the person who, in a 6,000 word piece about Herodotus for the New Yorker, said Herodotus would have been a person who used hyperlinks. In fact, his whole style of writing is essentially hypertextual in a funny way. So I'm not saying I have any problem with this. I think it's great. It's just, but that's not something I'm
I
Okay.
do.
Yeah, I just wondered if that the erudition aspect is enhanced or affected by the fact that the reader can instantly go off and find something while in the middle of your piece.
That's distracting, I would say.
Well, we live in an age of
old-fashioned.
distraction there, Daniel.
But you know, erudition, look, I mean, at the end of the day, every review of my new collection I pick up, you know, always says at some point, you know, he was trained as a classicist. And of course, I forefront that. I'm not saying this is a problem. But, you know, when you are trained as a scholar, erudition means something very specific. I mean, to whiz through references to things and, you know, click on the Wikipedia article and read the Wikipedia. Look, I do it. You know, I'm reading Saint-Simon now, God knows why, and I'm Googling, you know, Philip V of Spain, and I read the article, and then I think I know something about Philip V of Spain. I don't know shit about Philip V of Spain. There are people who spend their careers thinking about Philip V. And that's what I call erudition. I mean, I never refer to myself as a classicist because I walked away from that world. I was trained as a classicist, but I'm not a person who spends my life in libraries and texts, keeping up with the current scholarship, immersed in what's going on. I have only respect for real scholarship and real erudition. I think it's worth reminding people what that is. I mean, there are people who spend their lives on the things that you click on. And I use Wikipedia just as much as anybody else, although I'd like to say I also give them money every month because I think that's important.
Yeah. It's a nonprofit. You have to kick in something.
But that's not, you know, brushing up on stuff or taking an occasional deep dive into things is not erudition. Not even close. And I was kvetching before about the academy and, you know, why I left and the critical theory jargon and all of that. But all kidding aside, for real scholars who devote themselves to a subject, I have nothing but respect for that. And those are the people I consult when I really want to know something.
Is there something you would have, if you had stayed in academia, is there a dream topic, author, book that you would have focused on, or would you have been spending your life with Homer?
Not Homer. It was funny. Homer is like all good things in life. I sort of backed into. I was trained by a great Homerist, Jenny Strauss Clay, at the University of Virginia, who's a real scholar of Homer. But my actual field of specialization is Greek tragedy, particularly Euripides. I know as much about Homer as your average classicist, but I'm in fact not a Homer specialist at all.
We won't tell University of Chicago. That's okay.
No, but I mean, I remember thinking as an undergraduate that I didn't have the chops for Homer. You know, it was too intimidating for me. No, I was always a drama person. I was a Greek tragedy person. I wrote my dissertation on Euripides. So that's what I actually know about. If I can claim to know about anything as a classicist, as a specialist in the way we were just discussing. It's
and do you think you'd have focused within that?
Well, I think I would have gone on in tragedy. I don't know if I would have stuck with Euripides or expanded, but I'm very interested in the theater and in drama. And often there was a point when I wrote often about contemporary theater also. But I have no regrets. I think I would have been a perfectly respectable academic classicist, but I don't regret the choices that I made.
Which is always good. Getting beyond being the gay critic or the critic handling the gay books, because I recorded with Edmund White very early this year, and he talked about that ghetto as a gay writer / gay novelist that, you know, it seemed good when there was a market, and all of a sudden he realized he was in a ghetto that was very difficult to get out of.
Well, I mean, when I started, because I was gay and out, this was again 1990, and there was just emerging then the gay market in publishing. Big publishers were starting to have gay imprints, or like St. Martin's Press, I remember, was suddenly publishing a lot of gay nonfiction and fiction, as I recall. And, back in the day, this is, again, pre-internet, you wanted to publish. And looking back, it seems incredible and foolhardy, but, I did my PhD graduation, I think, was on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday I moved into a one-room apartment on 25th Street and just to be a freelance writer. So I wrote wherever I could, and there were always little gay magazines starting up, and I wrote for them. You get paid $100 an article, and you were happy to have it. But I was very alert even then to the dangers of getting ghettoized. Mm-hmm. Partly because temperamentally, and this is, I would say, also a big part of my intellectual project, such as there is one, it's a point I'm always recurring to. I'm very suspicious of categories and boundaries, as I was saying before, with respect to genre. And I didn't want to just be a gay critic. I spent years of my life thinking about Greek tragedy. I wanted to be able to write about that also, which is not to say I did not want to write about gay books if I thought they were interesting. So the whole labeling thing is something I've been trying to resist from the beginning. And I wrote a lot for gay magazines. I was as out as could be. I had no problem with it, but I didn't want to spend my life reviewing gay novels for gay magazines. Not that there's anything wrong with gay novels or gay magazines, but I had a large literary training, and I wanted to write about literature, not just literature, but, the arts in general in a large way in which I could bring all parts of me to bear on the thinking about whatever it was I was reviewing. The gay part of me, the classicist part of me, the Jewish part of me. I just hate this. I just hate this labeling. I mean, I think probably it's probably hurt me over the years because I never aligned myself with a constituency,
Usually before sitting down with someone, I'll hit up some of their peers / contemporaries, et cetera, just see if they have any questions. And going into this, A, we had short notice, but B, I was also like, I'm not sure if he's got longstanding enmities or, blown up relationships over this, that, or the other. Better not reach out to people.
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, when you're a critic,
yeah, that's where I was starting from. Yeah.
I have to say Edmund White is a person I admire a lot because I've written 2 very harsh reviews of him, and he's very genial and doesn't hold a grudge.
And he was exactly one of the people I thought, no, I'm not even going to.
No,
just because I didn't know. That's it. Yeah.
I think also you can't let that kind of stuff determine your life. Look, this young critic who wrote a very harsh review of this new collection, Ecstasy and Terror, I took him out for a coffee because I thought he was smart. Obviously, I don't agree with him about my book, but
I tell you where you're wrong.
This whole idea of holding grudges, I think I'm sure it happens, but it's all part of the game. But I don't think I've ever had a constituency. I've never been aligned with. Look, I never had a contributing writer job because I didn't want to be confined by one publication. I mean, there are publications, obviously, I've been associated with, but never officially. Even now, I'm working on a piece for The New Yorker, even though I'm now one of the editors of The New York Review. I never wanted to be hemmed in with respect to what I could or could not say or whose side I was or was not on. So I remember getting a call or an email a few years ago from someone at the Lambda Literary Foundation. And, I should say that back in the day, in the early 90s, one of the scratchy ways I made a name for myself was by being a gay critic who was not reflexively giving great reviews to gay novels. Which was sort of expected at the time, So the Lambda people got in touch, and I said, oh, finally, they're giving me the Lifetime Achievement Award or something, And they wanted me to present an award at some event of theirs, and I burst out laughing because, I never went the gay writer route. Mm-hmm. Although everybody knows that I'm gay, but, but I thought it was very important to sort of maintain a kind of independence, partly because, the thing I've written about, particularly my first book, is multiplexity, being many things at once. It's the most interesting part of identity. And the thing about identity that I dislike right now in the sort of public conversations about it is this constant drive on the people who say they're interested in identity to boil everyone's identity down to a thing, right? You're the black writer, you're the gay writer, you're the Jewish writer, as if that were the only part of you ever operative. And it's just ridiculous. And I have no patience for it. And in a lot of what I've written, both as a memoirist and as a critic, I kind of try to resist. Identity becomes more interesting the more multiplex it is, and we all do it. Nobody is a thing,
Again, I went to Hampshire 1990 to 1993, just in the wave of that identity culture, I think, starts rolling there and then, hits the rest of academia and beyond. And there was a degree of identify how you're alienated from white male culture. And they had to go through a whole lot of categories before they finally got to me being Jewish. I'm like, yeah, but that's not really...
That doesn't count anymore.
Well, that was also the problem I had with Hampshire that St. John's College provided the antidote for. It's a little bit in the Harold Bloom school of resentment thing that he brought up, but the sense of critiquing, Western civilization and culture without actually having a background in the books themselves.
Talking about.
And that's why when I get to St. John's, I'm like, oh, okay, let's read the books themselves and not a deconstructive take on this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
The joke was at Hampshire, you could take Shakespeare's treatment of women, but you couldn't just take a Shakespeare class. I had to go to UMass to study the plays themselves. So,
but I think, look, I'm now one of the co-directors of Bard's Great Books program, which we call First Year Seminar, and there's always great controversies about the syllabus. And my point of view is I'm not some mindless promoter of the classics. I know all the problems with this canon. Trust me. As a gay person, I know, it's not like, I'm not aware of what the power dynamics are behind canon formation, God knows. But you want to critique Western culture, which God knows is ripe for criticism, you have to know what the fuck you're talking about.
Right.
I remember going to lectures in grad school. All these black-clad, comp-lit graduate students would snigger at the name of Freud. They had never even read Freud. They just knew they were supposed to not like him. I thought, that's not education. That's indoctrination. I have no patience for it. And I always tell my students, you want to criticize the Western canon? Read it. Because for better or for worse, look, what we do as organizers of courses like this is not prescriptive. We are not telling people these are great and you must worship them. I think it is descriptive. For better or for worse, these are the central works of the civilization. And if you want to understand why our civilization has the problems it has, if you identify them as such, well, this will help you understand that. Mm-hmm. It seems very straightforward to me.
Yeah. But for 18-year-olds in this day and age, even my day and age coming up, I'm about 10 years younger than you. And it was the same, we'll be unified in our alienation. I'm like, that's not...
Well, I'm happy to talk about their alienation. I think that should be part of the course. I've tried to make it part of the course. You feel excluded. You feel that there is misogyny and nefarious power dynamics behind the canon. You're absolutely right. Let's talk about it.
Change of pace. I read in a recent interview with you that nobody asked you about interior decoration. So in a Aeneas sort of way... If you had to carry one thing out of here on your back, if there was some disaster going on, is there a piece that you just, this is the one thing I can't live without. I have to carry this to the new room.
It would not be a piece. It would be a book.
Yeah, I've got that. I have a path through my house where I grab things in case it's burning down, so I can get out with those. But
no, I
okay.
I was given as a gift by the descendant of a friend of Cavafy, one of Cavafy's original hand, self-published, hand-distributed folios of his poems with some of his manuscript corrections of he would take a bunch of poems to a printer and have them printed up and pin together a sheaf of poems and circulate copies of this folio. And I have one of them, and it has his own handwritten corrections to a bunch of the poems where he sort of bethought himself at the last minute before handing this to somebody, my friend's ancestor. That would be the first thing, I think. But no, objects, they come and go. You can always replace them. And if you can't, whatever. But I think that would be the thing I would go for. It always moves me to see Cavafy's handwriting. That's precious. I have other things that are precious, but no, I was joking in that interview because people, look, when I started, I used to interview people myself, and I would always look around because I think the person, if you're doing a profile, the person resides in many kinds of details and not just what they're telling you or what they're saying. That's why I was making that joke that, nobody says, oh, I love your
gardening
picture or your gardening. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's part of the challenge of doing this on a weekly plus basis is, figuring out something about the person themselves as opposed to just the books. Let me ask something. New York Review of Books. You mentioned you have an editorial role there. And again, I guess this goes back somewhat maybe more to Plato than the tragedies, but how does an institution survive when the founder is gone, or the founders are gone? Is virtue something that can be taught, I guess?
There's always a succession crisis, and it's always traumatic, and it's always explosive, and most of the times it survives. When I won't talk about the New York Review of Books because I was too close to Bob,
sure.
And I'm obviously now part of the establishment. But like if you look at the New Yorker, the huge turmoil every time there was a editorial shift. That was true from not so much, but it was partly true from Harold Ross, the founder, to William Shawn, his successor, when the magazine really changed very much from its 1920s incarnation to its mid-century incarnation. And then from Shawn to Bob Gottlieb, who, as you know, is a very close friend of mine, who took over for a few years, and then Gottlieb yielded to Tina Brown, which was an incredible upheaval. Institutions are institutions because they are separable from persons. Mm-hmm. That is what the word institution means. It is something that has been established independently of individual personality. So obviously they're imprinted by these great personalities. But if the various parties are concerned about the values of the institution and preserving them, things will be okay in the long run. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes institutions don't survive the death of the founder. But I think you could think of a lot of publications where there's been great anguish when the editorship shifts. The Paris Review.
I was just thinking of that. Yeah.
Yeah. This always happens. And it's also a matter of age. It's also a matter of how you construe the identity of the institution. So, when the new editorial lineup of the New York Review was announced this March, I guess it was, that Gabe and Emily and me as the editor at large. And I kept telling people, you have to keep saying in the various, interviews you're giving that Bob Silvers and Barbara Epstein, the founders of the New York Review, were in their early 30s when they started this thing. It was not always an éminence grise. The institution began as a young person's experiment. And people kept saying, oh, well, Gabe and Emily, they're so young. They're only in their early 30s. I'm like, they're exactly the age that Bob and Barbara was. That is the institution. So I think it helps to really think about what you're talking about. And then it becomes less scary sometimes, these shifts.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel Mad Men redeemed itself by the end of the
I didn't keep watching.
Okay,
I didn't keep watching.
Because that seemed to be the thing you got the most cultural play.
I still get hate mail for that piece. But, I will say, too, that I thought that piece was very typical of a kind of piece that I do. People remember it as this savage takedown. And that was only because the aura of hysterical adulatory hype was so great at the time that anything that wasn't in lockstep with that was conceived as a lèse-majesté. And the fact is, I had lots of good things to say about that show in this piece, which nobody remembers. Yeah. It was actually, it was negative ultimately, but it was quite mixed in many ways. I just never felt the love, and I am a completist.
Yeah.
I will read all of everything by an author. I never left things unread. I will watch a whole TV series. I will watch, I'm reading all of frickin' Saint-Simon, even this 100-page excursus about the 7 gradations of Spanish grandees. That makes me want to bang my head against the wall every morning when I read my 10 pages. And the fact that I did not watch any more Mad Men is just about, the most damning thing in my vocabulary as a critic. I just wasn't interested in these people. And that's me. Obviously, most people felt differently, but no, I never went on with it.
But you also go into the reason why people feel...
No, but I should also say that very often I'm willing to reconsider if I get enough pushback, So like a series that I started watching and I hated at first, I thought it was so unattractive, was Breaking Bad. And people kept saying, no, it's great.
You got to keep going. You got to keep going.
And I pushed through. And then I really did think it was one of the great things of all time. So, maybe I'll go back to it one day.
Oh, it does remind me of David Simon, the guy who did The Wire, where he... Oh, gosh, I think it was Sopranos is Shakespeare, The Wire is Greek tragedy, because The Wire is about institutions in the gods or, city institutions destroying people and their
could be.
Yeah.
I watched all of The Wire, and I thought, I said many times in print and privately, there's something very Aeschylean about it. It has this sort of dark, rich, sinister, brilliant darkness about it. I watched all of The Sopranos too. I have to think about it.
But so you hate everybody's favorite show is what we were saying. I'm just kidding. Let me ask you one thing, getting back to students, the Harry Potter thing. What I come across is the importance that plays in kids' lives, people who are, that 18 to 25 range now. Do you see that in their sort of literary background or a filter through which they approach classes at all? Is it something that comes up, I guess?
I don't know. I've certainly now... I thought first of all, I read all those books twice to my own kids. And I think they're great. It got a whole generation, as far as I understand, into reading in a way that previous generations had not been. So I have no arguments with...
Oh, yeah. I don't mean it in a derogatory way. I'm just wondering if that's a cultural touchstone for students in a way that actually...
I think that may already have passed. When I think of the Harry Potter generation, I think of people my kids' age who are now in their mid-20s.
I can't tell the age of anyone younger than me, so I'm closing in on 50.
Club.
So, yeah.
So I think maybe 10 years ago, I was noticing the Harry Potter influence more. I think probably other things have come along. I am very interested in, as a critic, partly because it had no interest for me at all as a reader, in fantasy, dystopian fantasy, all that stuff that is now huge. I was never interested in fantasy as a kid. I only read those books as an adult. Lord of the Rings, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis, blah, blah, blah. Was never interested. Still am not interested.
But
although I did read all the Game of Thrones book when I was writing about the TV show.
Oh, yeah.
With great, huge pleasure. I thought they were wonderful. I think that it's the thing I notice the most in students is their deep immersion in fantasy literature. I have a colleague at Bard who's written a wonderful book. Maria Cecere has written a wonderful book called Re-Enchantment, The Rise of Children's Literature. I may be getting some part of that wrong, but I read the manuscript. I thought it was brilliant. Which has a lot to do with the cultural and literary structures behind some of this material and why it's arisen so powerfully. I think that's very interesting. Just to put my cards on the table as a classicist, I think I can't help thinking that there's a kind of a decliney aura about fantasy. I think that wide public taste for fantasy over other forms of literature, I think, is a sign of exhaustion. I'm going to come out and say that and be sure to get lots of hate mail. I'm sort of thinking out loud, but
you can bounce
I'm
stuff off.
A little suspicious of the whole thing. I was trying last night on my Apple Plus TV, which gives me 8 trillion choices, and I'll read anything. I mean, I have no snobberies about, I'll watch anything, I'll read anything. But I was really struck that every new TV show is, the devil, an angel and a devil working together. It's just everywhere. It seems very late stage to me somehow. I need to think more about this.
Well, and I think that's in keeping with Titanic to Pearl Harbor. I think that's everybody. How do we come up with a Game of Thrones? Let's come up with another fantasy property that.
But I think this is. I agree with you. I think this is more successful. I think people really do want this stuff. Yeah. It's amazing to me how much of it. And now this Philip Pullman series is, although he's a case apart, I think, in a lot of ways.
No, but that's still. How do we come up with a big budget, non-realistic show that's going to. And Amazon is doing a giant Lord of the Rings open-ended universe adaptation.
Yeah, so I think that stuff is interesting. I'm interested in reality, so it was never.
Yeah, I was science fiction guy instead of fantasy.
I loved science fiction.
But of all these high prestige shows, The Americans was the one that grabbed me the most. The one about the sleeper spies.
I watched the whole thing.
Yeah, I've watched the finale multiple times.
Best final episode of any series I can remember.
Yeah.
I thought it was perfection. They did not put a foot wrong, and boy, could they have.
Emily Nussbaum and I talked. We recorded with her this summer, and I think that was the one I put up as the, of all the finales, that's the one that actually nailed it without having to do fan service and show you what happened to every single person. And just.
What did Emily say?
I think she was on board with that. She talked about whether the finale matters or not.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And in different types of shows, it does or doesn't matter. I think that one nailed it. And every time I've watched it, that moment on the train platform in Rouse's Point, I still, knowing that it's coming, I still get chills and freak out the same moment Kerry Russell does.
It's a great. I loved it. I wanted to write about that show.
Yeah.
And I still wish I had, because I thought in a weird way, Emily's a good friend of a very good friend of mine, Laura Miller. We all had dinner once. I would like to pick Emily's brains about this. In a weird way, I always thought that there's a kind of a subtext to the Americans as a sort of meta parable about acting. Because the whole thing turns on their ability to act their way through these preposterous setups
with
and disguises wigs and glasses and whatever. And I thought, this is really about acting in some way that I haven't
that's my
figured
take with almost every Tarantino movie. They're all really about acting.
But you
not
know,
about
going into a Tarantino movie, that it's never about anything but the movies. Yeah. And I have no problem with that. It's all very meta and sort of, it's like silver Latin literature. Everything is elusive and reverential. There's no even attempt at originality or authenticity, although it's very... I like a lot of Tarantino, although I hated Inglourious Bastards for kind of ethical reasons.
I just got into that with Stephen Heller, as a matter of fact. We talked about the swastika and
I had a hard
the symbology
time.
of that. But that'll take us into our next episode that we record.
Right. I know. We're going way off track.
I'm sort of hoping we do get together in the future.
Well, next year when I publish...
That's what I'm figuring. It's an hour and a half away, or we can meet in the city. Because my secret other reason for wanting to come up here, which is what I'm going to be doing after I leave your place, is visiting Philip Roth's grave.
Oh,
yeah. Oh. He was my white whale, who I never even approached for the show, but he was there are significant reasons I would have, and he never would have done something like this, but I nonetheless, would have loved to have done
once had a real conversation with him. We were at a lunch together.
Yeah.
Right before he died. And he told, my father idolized Philip Roth. And actually, when you hear Philip Roth talk, that's exactly how my father sounded.
Really?
My father's a Jersey City boy originally, before they moved to the Bronx. And he had read the Odyssey book, my Odyssey book about my dad, and said very nice things about it. And I thought, God, I wish my father were alive. If he could hear Philip Roth saying he had liked my book about my father, that would have been like the acme of his whole life. It was a bittersweet moment, I have to say. My father was a great fan of his.
On that note, I will leave you to it. You've got an appointment for later. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
And that was Daniel Mendelsohn. His new collection is Ecstasy and Terror, From the Greeks to Game of Thrones, from New York Review Books. It's got a ton of great essays, reviews, and the weird hybrids that Daniel talks about throughout our conversation. So pick it up. He's such a good writer, such an incisive one. Also, if you share virtually any of my interests, you will absolutely plotz over his previous book from 2017, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic. That's in paperback from Vintage. Now, Daniel's site is danielmendelsohn.com, which is DanielMendelsohn.com. And that's got links to his books, essays, press, event calendar, etc. He's on Facebook at daniel.a.mendelsohn and on Twitter at DAMendelsohnNYC. All one word. There'll be links to all that in the show notes for this episode. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Daniel, so, who you been reading? And as you can imagine, we went on kind of long with that, too. And if you want to hear his answers, and maybe get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get the fourth quarter 2019 episode up soon. You can check out the third quarter episode, which features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Carl Stevens, Emily Nussbaum, Kate Maruyama, Laniers, Christopher Brown, Caleb Crane, David Shields, Dawn Raffle, Amor Tolles, Simon Doonan, Simon Critchley, and Sylvia Nickerson. You can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. Now, I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including the bonus podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I really am going to get to, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at Daniel's home near Bard College, so it cost a couple of bucks for tolls, plus coffee. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think this show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Now, special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Edie Nadelhaft, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Pfau, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.